coming. I'm very happy to introduce Simon Knight, who's visiting us, and he's a doctoral student at Open University in England. Simon does interesting stuff at the intersections of information seeking, learning theories, technologies, and we've been fortunate to actually do some really interesting collaborations with him. I don't know if he's going to talk about that or not, but there's a lot of fun stuff that go right and wrong when you are working with how many hundred people?
Yeah, that'll get some mention.
Doing information search and writing activities in education context. So I'll let Simon take over and
cool.
He'll answer questions.
Thank you. So the way my screen's positioned, I'm getting slight glare. That's a bit better. So I'm going to talk about collaborative information seeking in the context of kind of learning sciences work. It's my talk, but I definitely want to give credit to the collaborators, Dirk Templar and his team at Maastricht University, who helped me collect a lot of this data. Matt and Chirag here, who helped a lot with the kind of setup and the actually with the design and the coding. And then my supervisory team, Karen, Simon, Bart and Fridolin, who are at the Open University. Although Simon has now moved to University of Technology, Sydney. And if anybody wants to talk to me about supervisor changing 2 years through a 3-year PhD, I can do that. Okay, so my interest in this work kind of started around thinking about the fact that often we talk about the internet as though it's a challenge, and the kinds of information that students look at where they might be reading competing claims. Perhaps teachers are concerned that they're trusting information that is not at all credible, and so on. So we have this problem, but then alongside that, new technologies provide us with opportunity to tackle those kinds of issues as well. So for example, through the use of browser extensions. And within the kind of learning sciences literature, there's a set of approaches. So performance assessment and evidence-centered design are two of them, where what we look at is a high-level construct that we're interested in probing, so kinds of literacy in this context. What behaviors might be indicative of those constructs, and then how we can design tasks that would elicit the salient indicators, so the types of behaviors that we're interested in. And this is particularly interesting because in the computer-supported collaborative learning work, this is slightly old now, but there's a paper by Winnie that reviewed all of the CSCL literature in the CSCL journal, and only 12% of articles, even in that journal, were using digital trace as a data source. So this kind of work is designed to address some of the calls for literacy-based performance assessments. And when I'm talking about literacy here, I don't just mean kind of the ability to match graphemes and phonemes, so to be able to kind of speak the words that are on the page, but a much deeper type of literacy that includes the comprehension and understanding of a rich digital multimedia. I've put digital literacy in here, but the digital is really redundant as far as I'm concerned. It's just that the digital element perhaps really foregrounds some of the challenges that readers face. And in my work, I've particularly tied this notion of literacy to epistemic cognition and the ways that people deal with multiple sets of documents and extract information from them. And in particular, the work that I'll talk about today focuses on this third level, where students or readers in general assess relevance, update their task needs, and then seek new information off the back of that. And this follows a kind of line of research in epistemic cognition or epistemic beliefs, and there are a few other similar constructs that fall into the same kind of broad area, that suggests that by looking at how students seek information during online searching, we can actually examine how they're thinking about the nature of knowledge, so epistemology, not just as this sort of decontextualized set of beliefs, so not just looking at their psychometric properties in using a questionnaire, but actually looking at how they deal with information as they come across it. And I've crossed out thoughts in this because I'm particularly interested in the behavioral processes that students go through. And I'm less interested in trying to posit sort of underlying cognitive structures. Okay, so what sorts of things might we be looking for as indicators of this kind of rich literacy? Well, there's a set of literature around that, which suggests the key skills that students need to be taught are a skill of integration. So can they connect prior knowledge to new knowledge and can make intertextual claims? So if multiple documents refer to the same types of claim, do they see those associations? Sourcing, so these are the kind of credibility judgments. Is this a good author? Should we trust this journal? And so on. And then corroboration, so looking for similar types of claims across multiple documents. You can think about particularly this last one in the context of different subjects as well, where corroborating eyewitness accounts are very interesting in history, say. I'm particularly interested in collaboration and the types of communication that students engage in when they're writing collaboratively authored documents seem to be associated with higher levels of literacy as well. So this sort of meta-discourse, so the talk around the qualities of texts and talk around that talk. So what does the fact that this text appears to be better than this one mean for the types of claims that we can make? So we designed some tasks that would explore this type of construct and those indicators and elicit those indicators. And those tasks were these collaborative information seeking tasks. And we set up 2 collaborative tasks facilitated by a browser add-on, so that was Cogmento, which I think you all know. One of the tasks was we gave them a set of documents, so they had those in the session, and they could explore other resources, but they were told to focus on those documents. And then the other was open search on the web. And the kind of prompt that they were given was to write a review of the best supported claims around the risks of a substance. And that substance was either a herbicide called glyphosate or a food supplement, which was called red yeast rice. And the reason we chose those was we wanted it to be something they were unlikely to know very much about. And it was outside of their area of expertise. And we also wanted it to be something where there was a bit of a kind of challenge. There were maybe conflicting opinions on the safety of this substance. And we asked them to act as though they were a government advisor, advising a minister who was thinking about reviewing the license for these substances. And the specifics for these cases came out of looking at scientific controversies through a number of places. So I looked at the Wikipedia. There is actually a category, scientific controversies, and had a look through those. Actually, most of them they're not controversial in the sense that they're done deals. Many of them were, they received a lot of press coverage, and they involve conspiracy theories, but they're not the kind of controversy that these are, where there's actually genuine competing claims, but also the types of claims come from different groups of people, perhaps. Also, the Daily Mail headline here is one of my favourite Daily Mail headlines. If only I could just stick to the headlines. Well, I do. So the multiple document processing one was the glyphosate-based one, and we went through a load of resources here, some of which were linked from that Guardian article, and identified which ones agreed with each other. So we can see here, these two agree with each other, and they have a particular perspective, and then these two disagree. And these were interesting. A lot of the research in this area tends to use simpler sets of documents, where actually the source features, if they're attended to, should probably naturally lead people to a kind of outcome where it's not too hard a decision to make between which sources you're looking at. Whereas with these, so for example, this one looks like a scientific report. Actually, if you delve a little bit deeper, you can see that it's hugely problematic. This Farmers Weekly piece is just a reprint of the press release by a science literacy website, but this is written by a set of professors at various universities. Ditto on this line, there's this peer review publication, so ostensibly it should be very trustworthy. It's reprinted in Reuters, again, a very credible venue, and then a blogger critiques it. Now, it would be entirely justifiable for a student to look at the peer review publication here and think, oh well, it's obvious which one is the most trustworthy here. But actually, the blog contains the best quality of critique and the kind of most scientific information out of all of those. And you'll also notice that there are three sort of subtopics here. So we were interested in how they identified these. And in fact, the one that's least represented is perhaps the most concerning one. So the risk of glyphosate to agriculture, if it's not controlled in various ways, is a genuine concern. And that's where the scientific controversy would lie. So with the red yeast rice case, the open web search, we did the same kind of thing. Looked at types of documents that students might come across, and again, you could identify three kind of core subtopics within that. So it acts, the active ingredient is a statin. It often has contamination, or there are concerns around its contamination with citrinin, and its concentration varies massively depending on which brand you buy. This was also interesting because statins are slightly controversial in their own right within the kind of medical literature, although as it happened, none of the students delved into that area. So the Cogmento tool provided us with a way to access the chat of students as they were exploring these documents. It foregrounded searches to the partners engaged in them. The students could share snippets, which are just like copies taken from the page, or they could just copy and paste, which is what they actually did more frequently. And then it has a built-in Etherpad, so they could click on a button that said Task Pad. That took them to a page where they could construct their answers with their partner. So of course we have all of the data from the Etherpad. We know who wrote what. We have the page views, and we also have the copy data. So we know which pages students actually copied information from as well. So the process was we observed them looking for things. They would type in queries, and we have a log of those queries as well. I just love the animated GIF, really. And then we can see which pages they're sourcing information from, so along the bottom, and how that gets translated into what's in the document. Particularly in the multiple document processing task, we actually know stuff about those documents. So we know that A appears in document 1 and not A appears in document 2. and that C only appears in document 1. So we can see how people source from those and whether or not they spot those contested claims and foreground them, whether they make those intertextual ties. We also know some of the metadata. So we know the authorship, we know the year it was published perhaps, and so on. To some extent we can get that in the information seeking task too. And we can again see whether or not that appears in the written outputs and in the chat data as well. This is particularly interesting because we know that participants, so this is from experimental work by Kobayashi, and we know that in experimental work students will identify the better quality source, but that they make little reference to source features when they do that. So they don't actually identify very many of those by type sentences. And very rarely does that then get translated into their justifications in the documents. So in that case, it was under 6% of the 154 participants. Coincidentally, we have about 154 pairs in each of our cases. So kind of similar numbers, which is entirely accidental. So we worked with about 1,100 Maastricht first year business and economics students, and they were given a choice between taking our kind of study session or doing another task. And they essentially received a kind of study credit for taking part. They had the cogmento terms which they agreed to, and they also gave a kind of wider research consent than that, which included, must be an onward slide, but it included they did have a briefing before the session. In the session they were given a brief overview of what was going to happen. A few of them did choose to do either the other task in advance or they chose to do it at the start of that session, but most students decided to stick with doing this. Unfortunately, about 250 of the students ended up doing it individually because we had problems with the software, which again I can kind of talk to people about in more detail, but it's an interesting experience. I kind of wish that I had a we got them to do the tasks individually, which worked absolutely fine from a kind of student experience perspective, but it meant that we had quite a lot of data loss from that, and there were ways that we might have been able to save more data whilst still getting them to do it individually if the software had failed. Benefit of hindsight. About 250 did do the task collaboratively, but there were server problems partway through the session, so we've discarded that data as well. And then the headline figure is that we have about 600 participants, and that's pretty evenly split across the two tasks, so 300 multiple document, 300 in the SIS task, and those are all paired as well. There are some triples, but we've mostly removed those, and it was a very small number in any case. So before the session, they had a briefing, as I said. They completed a psychometric. So the psychometric is the internet-specific epistemological beliefs questionnaire, which was designed by a group in Oslo that do research around multiple document processing and epistemic cognition. It's interesting to note, and I'll come back to this, that in their original study, they validated this with, I think it was about 150 students. So we have about 900, 950 responses to the AIESEC, so it's a much bigger number of students now. And we also collected just basic demographics in advance. In the session itself, again, they were briefed, and then they had a warm-up task. So this was a kind of factual retrieval closed question. And they looked something like this. So we asked them about educational expenditure per primary student in a particular country. I think that question is directly lifted from Dan Russell and his research blog. Total health expenditure, and then how much a Big Mac costs. So there's a thing called the Big Mac Index. These were economics and business students, so these were questions that were kind of tied to their topic area. The original intention here was that this data would be used as a kind of baseline search skill. Actually, it became very quickly apparent that that just wasn't going to work, because we needed to be able to get students to spend equal amounts of time on the tasks. And we didn't want students to be spending kind of 15, 20 minutes doing this and then having a shorter time on the next session. So instead, what this has done is it's provided us with a kind of training slot. So before they do the bigger session, where they have about 45 minutes to write the big report to the minister, they complete these short tasks. We would circulate the room and support them in understanding how to use Cogmento, making sure they all had the chat bar open, that they knew where the task pad was, making sure that they were using Firefox, because some students had Firefox open for the tasks but then switched to Internet Explorer to actually do their searching, which just seems like a crazy thing to do to me, but there we go. Right, exactly, yeah. And it gave us the chance to kind of answer any of their questions whilst they were doing this very preliminary stage. So it was a very useful warm-up bit, but not in the way that had originally been intended. And then for the second task, the main task, they just had this a review of the best supported claims around the risks, and they had about 45 minutes for that. And then they completed a short exit questionnaire in the last 5 to 10 minutes. And that exit questionnaire included things like how familiar they were with their partner prior to that session, their self-reported search expertise, and self-reported topic knowledge prior to the session. We also asked them to rank on a scale of 1 to 10 each of the documents for how trustworthy they were. And for the SIS task, we asked them to give a ranking of the most, least, and average trustworthiness of the websites that they encountered. Actually, we also gave them a slot to put in URLs on the SIS one. So if they could remember which websites they thought were best or worst, they could put those in. Slightly to my surprise, quite a lot of students have put those in. I haven't done any extensive analysis on that yet, but just eyeballing the data, it does look like a reasonable number filled that in. After that session, we'd set up for the following week for them to do a kind of peer and self-assessment task. So the intention here was that they would log back into the system, and again, thank you, Matt. Matt did all of the coding for this side of things. They completed what I called a kind of diagnostic assessment. So to the students, it was a training task. They were given 3 documents similar to the ones that they'd been asked to create and asked to mark them. For me, I wanted to see how they would mark those, and the intention was to kind of weed out people who were wildly off in their judgments of these ones, of the samples that they'd been given. And then they went on to do 2 peer assessments and a self-assessment.
Sorry, were these actual reports from the study?
So the 3 training ones weren't. They were ones that I'd written in advance. And then the peer and self-assessment were obviously, yeah.
They were actually assessing their peers?
Yeah, yeah. And those were, they were within their topic as well. So if you did the MDP task, you got an MDP one to mark. There were 2 reasons for doing this. One was there is some research around epistemic cognition and assessment capabilities, so ability to mark these kinds of texts. And the other reason was, frankly, because I didn't want to have to hand mark all of them. So actually, so a third reason is that I think there's educational value in doing this. But the intention was that we would have 4 markers for each of the outputs from this now. and that we would be able to use that data as a kind of outcome variable. Again, I'll come back to that in a bit. Okay, so I mentioned the AIESEC earlier, and this is my visual representation of the AIESEC. So it includes measures of how students think about the simplicity of knowledge, so whether they see it as compartmentalized or interconnected. How students think about justification for knowledge, so whether they think observation is like the key thing for justification, or rules of inquiry, so there's a little Bunsen burner and what are those called? Jars there. How they think about the certainty of knowledge, so is it tentative and evolving, or is it kind of fixed and certain, static? And then how they think about sourcing, so is it kind of a given? Can you just read it off the page and take it, as it were? Or is it kind of socially constructed through dialogue, not necessarily spoken word, but kind of interaction with texts and people? So that was given in advance. As I said, we also collected GPA and other demographics in advance, and then after they'd done the main tasks, we got self-report, prior knowledge, self-report search skill, and partner familiarity. And then from the trace, we can start to look at things like number of pages visited, number of pages used. So that was, I've operationalized that as if they took a snippet, a copy, so that's just Control-C. They referred to the URL in the chat, or the URL appears in the Etherpad, then that page is useful. So you can get a subset there and start to look at precision and recall for those groups. I'm following Roberto and Chirag's 2011, I want to say, conference paper.
From Cigar?
Yeah, in kind of computing some of those metrics. Obviously, looking at page dwell is an obvious and relatively easy thing to do as well, so we can start to look at which pages groups looked at, and then also the set of pages that all groups looked at for a particular period of time. Look at queries made, again, by groups and by everybody. And I've also, so over the right-hand side at the bottom here, representing the chat data. And what I've done with that, rather than going in and trying to do a close analysis now, a priori, we know a set of key terms around the topics that the students were discussing. We also know a set of key terms around around sourcing. Some of those are specific to the particular sources, so things like it was written in The Guardian. Others are just more general, so the expression written by or written in, published in, and things like that. So looking for those sorts of key terms. And then I have another set of key terms around what might be characterized as exploratory or epistemic dialogue. In the US, the work around accountable talk is better known, particularly in education circles. And there's a kind of set of key terms there around things like because, I think, anything that's kind of explaining or trying to work with somebody else to build knowledge. And I've coded each of the messages sent just using a binary coding. So did this include a topic term? Yes, no. I'm not particularly interested in the number of topic terms within those messages, just whether or not it was about topic stuff. And then we can look for relative incidence across all of the messages that group sent. I've also looked at a kind of collaborative symmetry measure. So for this, if we say a group is 0, that implies that both partners visited the same number of pages. If we say they're 1, that would imply that one partner visited all of the pages in that group and the other partner didn't visit any pages at all. So we can create those, it's just a normalized difference for all of the various metrics that we're using. For the outcome constructs, as I said, the peer assessment element unfortunately didn't really work. The data was very unreliable, actually surprisingly unreliable. So I've recently gone through and I've assessed them all myself, looking for topic coverage. In some ways that's just a keyword spotting thing, because it's looking for, do they make explicit reference to those 3 subtopics I referred to earlier. Source diversity, so whether or not they make reference to explicitly, for the most part, although there were times where actually, particularly in the multiple document processing task, it's so obvious where they're sourcing from. I've kind of given them marks for it. And that's 0 to 1 sources referred to, they got a 1, 2 to 3, they got a 2, 4 and above, they got a 3. And the reason I've set the threshold at 4 and above is because there is a point where actually adding more sources doesn't necessarily improve the quality of the output. One thing I might do there is look at, do they present contesting views? So do they identify and refer to when 2 sources say different things about the same topic? And then they were marked for source quality or evaluation, which is fairly self-explanatory, and how well they synthesized. It was interesting, particularly in the multiple document processing task, many students wrote article 1 says ... article 2 says ... etc. and didn't synthesize at all. And we can create a 1 to 12 score from that. So we end up with a row per student if we want to use the summary data, or we can start to look at delving into process data, so looking at the chats and looking at the processes and sequences present in the information seeking behavior as well. And we can start to think about how the various things that we had in advance, particularly the AIESEC, the trace data, and then the outputs actually all match up. And that's kind of where I am now. It took a surprisingly long time to do the inter-rater reliability assessment on the peer assessment data, which set me back quite a long way. So at the moment, I've looked at the AIESEC as a psychometric instrument, and as I say, I've marked the outcome data myself now, having looked at the inter-rater reliability. I've looked at the trust data with respect to outcome and the AIESEC, and it looks like, slightly to my surprise, there's no, we can't factor them, and there don't seem to be any clusters in the ways that people have responded to that. I think that's probably because, and the benefit of hindsight again, the documents were so complex. So as I said earlier, it's very hard to make a judgment about how you rate the trustworthiness of a peer review article that isn't very good, because the kind of metadata says high quality, but then actually once you delve below that, it isn't. And I'm not sure how I would rate on a 1 to 10 scale those things on at least some occasions. So perhaps doing things like saying, which of these do you believe more? So a kind of forced choice decision would have been a better way to deal with that. The AIESEC is also interesting because, as I said earlier, the original validation was with about 150-ish students. So we had a much bigger sample. And the conceptual structure is that you have 4 factors. Actually, analysis shows that this reveals 2-factor structure, and it almost exactly mirrors the original study. So So there's 2 items that are different, I think, which is interesting in its own right. But it does reduce the kind of number of variables that we can take from that. So there might be interesting predictions that we would make around how students conceptualize the simplicity of knowledge and the types of traits that we might then see. If we've only got two factors, that might affect the types of hypotheses we generate. There's a huge caveat on these latter findings in particular because they are very much in process, but it looks like if you just take a binary on the outcome data for evaluation, so they engaged in some evaluation, they got a 2 or a 3, versus no evaluation, they got a 1. The students visited more pages, so that's just an ANOVA. With the exploratory dialogue and topic talk, that's looking at the instance of those codes within the chat data. So it looks like they talked more about the topics, and they also engaged in a more exploratory dialogue. And then if you look at the topic groups, so whether or not they talked about 0, 1, 2, or 3, and that's the only one where 0 was a code. The groups that scored higher on that, there's also a higher instance of topic codes within their chat. And that's a linear relationship. So the cautions on those, just to delve into that a bit more. Obviously we had the data loss. The AIESEC is 2 factors, as I mentioned, but perhaps more importantly, we're also looking at paired data. So the obvious way to deal with psychometric instruments is to use them as a kind of continuous variable. With paired data, what we've had to do is look at the top quartile and the bottom quartile scoring on each of the factors and create a code for those. So top quartile is H for high, and if both partners are in the top quartile, then it's HH, and we do that for both of the factors. So there's a kind of data loss there as well. Chat data is also rather sparse. So for each group, there's somewhere between, it goes very low, but I think sort of 20 to 30 would be a fairly average number for the main task chat data. I haven't looked at the warm-up based chat data, but actually there might be interesting things there because there might be kind of negotiation over roles that takes place prior to going into the main task. So that's worth looking at, particularly when I do a deep dive. I've already mentioned that the MDB documents were very complex, and whilst I think that's a very important thing in the consideration of high-level literacies, it also makes the research much more complex and much harder. And actually, I think if I were rerunning a kind of, engaging in performance assessment, again, I might go for a simpler set of documents where the kinds of qualities were in some ways much clearer, both to the students and the researchers. The other caveat to add is that the factual accuracy of the outputs they produce, I haven't assessed that. I've assessed it in the sense that I've eyeballed the data and I've marked them all, so I am aware that some of the students' outputs are not factually accurate. None of them is wildly off, but some of them are misjudging the qualities. Now that matters because in some cases, they evaluate the sources, they synthesize really well, they include all of the topics, and they have a wide range of sources as well. So they're scoring maybe even 12, but they're evaluating the sources incorrectly. And that's part of the reason I'm interested in maybe looking at whether they present contested claims or not. So, my kind of conclusions from running that kind of study and this sort of research is there are huge challenges around running large and complex studies. So in this case, we both had the fact that there was a large number of participants and we were running an international a transatlantic collaboration. But we also had the fact that in the CIS case, we don't know about the qualities of the websites in advance. And in the MDP case, whilst I think there's huge value to realism in presenting the types of resources that we did, it makes analysis much harder. I do think that this sort of task, information seeking, and particularly collaborative information seeking, both in the context of search and multiple document processing, is a fantastic lens onto student literacy and their kind of information skills. So I would kind of encourage people to do more of this sort of research, because I think it's really important, and it's also, I mean, it's exciting and interesting. And then the kind of final point that in some ways is, it's a point I want to make fairly strongly, particularly in work that I develop going forward, is the kind of logic of inquiry within this study, where we kind of set up we were looking for high-level constructs, looked for what would indicate the presence of high-level literacy skills, and then tasks to elicit that. That's a really important way of doing research, and and it kind of shouldn't be forgotten in how we build our hypotheses and tasks and so on. Cool, and I will leave things there. Thank you.
Questions?
Actually, one to ask about the warm-up task.
Yeah.
When we were going back and forth about that, we had mentioned that the answers were in a small set of sources, like the Big Mac Index.
Yeah.
Like already pre-compiled there, big comprehensive list. Had you had a chance to look at whether they find those sources or how long it takes them to get there?
Yeah, so I've decided, I'm not going to go back to that slide, but the warm-up tasks involved factual retrieval. We know the sources where that information exists, and actually, because we know the countries that the students were asked to look it up for, and we know the sources, it wouldn't even be that hard for us to just look at the Etherpad that they had for that question and see whether or not the correct number is in there. And you could script that, right? No, I haven't done that though. Partly because, as I say, if we were interested in how quickly students had done it and previously they'd been trained in the use of the tool, then I think that would be a very worthwhile thing to do. In this context, I'm just not sure what it would mean, because it might mean that they suck at searching. It might mean that they arrived to the class late, or that their computer was slow to start up. It might mean that they were getting familiar with the tool, but then they did, and worked with it fantastically, and so on. I was fairly confident. I was in the room for all but one of the sessions that we ran that week. So it was 11 hours in a computer lab for 4 days, and then a little bit more on and I was pretty confident that by the end of that warm-up, the students were happy with kind of how everything worked and where everything was. During it, not so much, because we were going around and kind of helping them out quite a lot as well. Yeah.
So you mentioned that the peer-reviewed results weren't useful, and that's because the inter-rater reliability was low?
Yeah.
Did you take away any, make any conclusions about that? So I think there were a few issues with that. One was that the diagnostic element, so the training bit that they had to do first, we had a small glitch on, and I think some of the students
So some students just couldn't get through it, and we just ended up saying, don't worry about it, you're done. Some students, I think, kind of struggled to get through it and then were quite frustrated. So by the time that they got to the peer review element, they just wanted to get it over with. The rubric was probably more complex than necessary. So the original rubric had 6 elements. The texts that were written for the training example were written to kind of probe those. So there were differences across the 3 samples that they were given on each element of the rubric. But it could have been simplified. And if I was doing it again, I would keep, I think the 4 levels that I have now work quite nicely. They were perhaps also, they were all told in advance that this would be a part of the task and that it would involve doing it at home and so on. But perhaps they could have been told more. Or perhaps they needed to kind of tick a box that said, yes, I understand that there will be a follow-up element as well. Because I think some of them hadn't quite realised that there would be an additional element to the task. And they could have dropped out at any time, but yeah. And it was a period where they had exams coming up in a few weeks and so on. So I think they found that a bit difficult too. In general, I think that the model of having a kind of training set, then peer and self-assessment, I really like that as a paradigm. I think that works quite nicely. But clearly it needs heavy piloting and validation. The other thing to say actually is we didn't just use the rubric. For each of the peer and self-assessments they did, they also had to select 3 things that could be improved about the thing that they were reading. And they had a drop-down menu which gave them the elements of the rubric, so they had to kind of categorize what their improvement was about, and they had another option as well. And then they had a text box. And again, I haven't looked at this extensively, but what they've written in the text box from just eyeballing the data seems to be very good, and they seem to be giving really kind of well-considered and thoughtful feedback to the students. But it's just that when it came to the numbers on the rubric, that wasn't the case, seemingly.
So you're saying that you can actually use their actual comments, feedback, but
Yeah.
not this selection on scale.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. Which is quite, I mean, from an educational perspective, that provides me with a lot of comfort as well, because we did give that feedback to the students. So it's frustrating that the numbers were clearly problematic. And I'm sure, the students will have realized that, because presumably some of them will have received scores that were quite different. But the written text is good. So they have at least had some useful formative feedback on the stuff that they wrote.
More questions, comments? All right, thanks, Simon. Oh, sorry.
I'm
Sorry.
So the software that you used was able to, in addition to what, did they not report where they searched, or you just got that data in the background?
So that's the software from the lab here, and it records their queries, the pages they view, whenever they take like Control-C or Command-C. They can take snippets, and different versions of it have different additional elements. And it has the chat tool built in as well, so we have all of the chat from that tool as well. Does that?
Also, like, overwhelming majority of people use the standard search engines, Google, Yahoo, Bing. So I think probably at least 90%
Yeah.
use Google, not everyone. So we just we also collected the results that approximate results that people would have seen at the time. So as soon as someone issued a query, we called the Google API and we got the top 10 results that they would have probably seen. So, yeah, in addition to everything else.
And this was all done in the computer lab?
Yes.
So the study itself was done in a computer lab at Maastricht, and it was just in the business school. And then all of the, so it's a browser add-on that they were using, and the servers are all hosted here.
Okay. So people would log into the software and you would know who was
Yeah.
logging on and what they were doing?
Yeah.
So it wouldn't matter if they logged in from in a lab or a home, it was the same data we could get.
Did you know whether or not they were had multiple windows open?
We usually encourage them not to open
Right.
multiple windows.
You know if they open new tabs.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, we do.
You didn't know if they had opened up new tabs, okay.
So the page view is the active tab. I don't know how that deals with, so if I have two windows open and I switch between them, presumably it doesn't record that I've just changed active tab, right?
No, Windows
No.
not.
Okay.
Only tabs.
Yeah, we did discourage them from keeping. And the other thing, I cleared the cache between every session and made sure that any additional windows were closed and all of that sort of stuff. But yeah, there's probably data loss there as well.
So most times people don't have multiple windows, they will have multiple tabs. I mean, tabs is a bigger kind of thing to deal with than...
Yeah, but sure, you deal with expert searchers and I don't know,
No.
people do use multiple windows,
Actually,
you know?
it depends on what operating system you use in Windows. It's pretty easy to open a new window. You just click the icon, and all of a sudden a new window is open.
It opens a new window.
Yeah.
And a Mac, it just goes back to the same window.
Yeah.
And
That's the same.
if you're used to Internet Explorer, they've only had tabs for like a year and a couple of years. Like, it's not that long. And it's not a very nice function in Internet Explorer either. So I think a lot of people still use Windows. I mean, I think about 300 tabs open in 5 windows. I'm a crazy person, but I have friends who will never open more than like 5 tabs at a time. So for them, there's no value. They might as well just open new windows. I think a lot of people still use Windows. Yeah.
So did you also track time on task?
No,
Well,
not well.
Indirectly.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can get it.
It depends. It depends what you count as time on task, right?
This is the size
So
that I also found.
I was in the room, and we can tell from the server log what pages they're on, when they are visiting or not visiting things. We can tell if there were massive pauses, although I haven't looked for those because, one, it might mean multiple things. It might mean that they're reading a page. It might mean they've fallen asleep. And 2, I think I'd have to do quite a close analysis to work out which of those 2 things it was. So from the server logs, we can kind of tell how long they spent on particular elements. But we know when they started and we know when they ended because I was in the room and I timed things. So some students spent a couple of minutes either side on either finishing up the warm-up task or extending their time on the information on the main task. But for the most part, they stuck to what we'd asked them to do. And I also know that they didn't seem to be engaging in very much sort of chit-chat. And there's not a huge presence of like Facebook and stuff like that in the logs. Now that's partly because they used Internet Explorer for Facebook, so they switched between different browsers for stuff. But it didn't seem like there was a huge amount of that. So Maastricht is kind of, I don't know, it's a kind of similar university to Rutgers. Like they're really highly motivated, very intelligent and able, and wanting to get on with stuff students. Now that's not to say that they're not going to try and go off task, but
you had people in the lab, right?
Yeah, right,
You had
yeah.
People at home,
Yeah.
and they did all kinds of crazy
Yeah,
things,
so
not just
the-
Facebook.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
live study that we ran last summer, it was we had to scrap.
When they're in the lab, even if you're not watching
when
them,
they were live,
they're,
Yeah,
they
yeah,
have
yeah.
more
They were
discipline.
looking at YouTube videos.
Right.
And there were always, or almost always, there were two of us in the lab
Right.
as well, so kind of
So that
wandering
definitely
around.
changes it. Whenever we have had people doing
Even
things
in
from
here
home.
in the lab, like people rarely, like maybe 1%, they within the session they go to any other sites.
Right.
Sometimes people went to YouTube just to listen to music.
Right, yeah.
But actually, since we capture the videos, we actually know which users did that, so
Okay.
we can eliminate that only those couple of pages and still have the data valid. But in the live study, we don't know.
Yeah.
The other thing that also matters is the type of extrinsic motivation that they have.
Mhm.
So what we have found, for instance, when we have people doing this for extra credit,
Yeah.
they're not as reliable as when people doing for money.
Oh, that's interesting.
But because I think, and I guess it also depends how you structure this. So for instance, we found that for the extra credit, they kind of had this misunderstanding, or rather understanding, that all they have to do is show up,
Right, yeah.
and it doesn't matter what they did; they would
Yeah,
get
yeah,
extra credit
yeah.
anyway,
Yeah.
right? Whereas when we're paying money, we pay the money at the end of the session. So
Sure.
there's this kind of implicit understanding
Yeah,
that
yeah.
if I screw up or if I don't do something, then I don't get paid.
Mhm.
Even though we never told them that, right?
Yeah.
So often when we were doing this with extra credit thing, we had to tell them that, look, you still have to do, you don't just automatically
Yeah, yeah,
get
yeah.
that extra credit just because you showed up. We would still have to, but there is definitely a clear difference in that performance. Often also what we do is, in addition to that payment, we have prizes.
Right.
Because even, people may like, well, I showed up, and if I do something, I just spend like an hour here, I'll get paid. So I don't have motivation to do good, right? And so we have these prizes in
Yeah,
addition
yeah.
to that, and so that kind of motivates people. And often people actually ask us at the end of the set,
Yeah.
hey, when are you?
When are we getting paid, and who are the winners and
Yeah.
stuff like that. Usually we can't do it right away.
Sure, sure.
You
Yeah.
do some analysis, find like the best performance, and then they keep asking. Some people don't care.
But it could also backfire. So Chris is looking at the study, the data from high school, which did like 40 years ago, and that was not in the lab. That was from home or whatever. And we weren't paying them, but we said the most active users would get this iTunes gift cards, right? And we were giving them points according to that activity.
Right.
And then these are high school students.
So
They started gaming the system. Right? They realized that for every chat message they get 5 points. Right? Or every bookmark they get, they would get 10 points.
Yeah.
Things like that. So they would just start doing things blindly just to. And so then we had to put a limit to you can only get this many per day. So then you're stuck with this.
Isn't gamification fun?
So, but this thing is fun. Like the external motivation. You have to be very careful.
Yeah, yeah.
That you have to provide them something, but it also cannot be so much that they start gaming the system.
Yeah. For these students, it was doing this task or doing another task, and the other task would have taken longer. So it would have taken them both the in-session element, and then they would have had homework that was longer as well.
So so each of the students who did this task from beginning to end, it was one session?
Yeah.
And
So,
that lasted about how long?
so in total, they had an hour and 15 in the lab.
Okay, so very reasonable amount of time.
Yeah. Yeah, so we tried running it again in a different university, and that was really interesting because they were master's students. So I thought in advance, they'll find this fine, and they'll just get into it really easily. And they had, I think it was an hour, so it was a shorter time. So we got rid of the warm-up task, and they really struggled with it to the extent that I'm not even going to look at the data from that session, because they were finding it quite hard to engage in and so on. So the thing around kind of the type of student that you're working with is absolutely true. It's
Yeah. So Max Wilson.
yeah.
So Max did this a couple of years ago as a part of this workshop at CHI. It was called Repli-CHI.
Yeah.
And so the idea is to take an existing study and replicate it. That was a very interesting exercise because, I mean, a lot of times, we do these things and, there are some interesting findings, but there's no telling if it can ever be repeated.
Sure.
And so the whole workshop was designed, and so Max chose to take one of our studies and replicate it. And it was a reasonable replication, same task, same kind of system, and Roberto and I helped a lot to kind of make. So some things were similar, a lot of things were different, and the difference was mainly attributed to different population that they were working
Yeah.
with. So we had undergrads doing that task, and he had master students
Right.
doing that. Also, the motivation was different. They were, we had people coming and doing this because we were paying them, and his students were doing this because it was sort of part of the course requirement or something
Yeah.
like that. And so, it was an interesting exercise, and I think, I wish there were more of these efforts are done because there's a lot of interesting lessons to learn from.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just repeating even your own study on a different setting and kind of,
Yeah.
see how it kind of works. So, all right. Okay, let's thank Simon again.
Thanks.